All right, so here we are, you guys. So we are going to be doing a recap of round number 11 of the Tata Steel Chess Masters tournament played today. A lot of drama, obviously. Daniil Dubov did test positive for COVID, and he is forfeiting the remainder of his games. Fortunately, that should not affect too much in terms of the overall standings in the tournament, although this does mean that Magnus Carlsen is guaranteed an automatic victory in the 13th round of the tournament, meaning that he just needs to keep the lead for 2 more rounds, and he then will be assured of winning. So today he plays the game against Vidit Santosh Gujarati from India. So the game starts out with e4. We have e5 played here, bishop to c4, and now we have knight f6 here and d3. Now some of you will notice that Magnus has played the bishop's opening in some of the online tournaments. Now when we last did a video, there were a lot of people who seemed to misunderstand my humor, and when I referred to myself in the third person by saying Hikaru, where they thought that it was like an ego boost or a flex or something of that nature. However, I simply do that because I find it fairly amusing. It has nothing to do with thinking I'm some hero or anything of the sort. Anyway, so d3 was played by Magnus in quite a few games against myself in some of the meltwater tournaments, the early ones in 2020, when we thought that COVID was this horrible thing and we were going to be stuck with it forever. And then sometime we thought it would ease up, but it seems like we're right back in that same situation now. All right, so we have d3, knight c6 played here. Now, I played c6 and d5. I also played this bishop's opening against Wesley So in the final match of the Speed Chess Championship in 2020 as well. So this is something that has been played a little bit. Anyway, we have knight c6 and now knight f3, bishop c5, and Magnus makes a very peculiar choice here to play knight c3. Now again, when white plays the Gucci piano, and especially as it's become more popular in recent years, almost everybody plays c3 followed by either d4 or b4. Magnus chooses to play knight c3, and now one note that I will make is I'm gonna have to pause for a second to find this. But one of the first books, in fact I think it was the first book that I ever received as a gift for winning a chess tournament, was at the Manhattan Chess Club in 1997. And when I won that tournament, I got this book, and I'm just trying to find it. Let me see if I can find it. I just have to find a picture of the cover. Yes, I got this book as a gift, and the book was called Attacking Chess: Aggressive Strategies and Inside Moves from the US Junior Chess Champion. And it was a book by Josh Waitzkin and Fred Waitzkin. Now you can find that book for about $6 these days, so it's obviously pretty cheap. But I remember the reason that rings a bell, and I've said this before, is because in that book, the very first game was, I don't remember who played it, but there was the mirror game. So this line with castles, bishop g5, bishop g4, knight d5, knight d4. And then after knight takes f6, g takes f6, bishop h6, knight f3, g f3, bishop h3 here. White can now play, I believe the move here is king h1, and white should be much better long term. At any rate, the reason I mention that is because this line with knight c3 and the Gucci piano is generally considered pretty dry and not an attempt at gaining an advantage. So it's definitely a little bit peculiar that Magnus plays knight c3 and not the traditional c3 move. If he plays knight c3, we have h6 played here, h3, a6, a4, d6, bishop to e3. Now again, very slow, very dry. The bishops are traded, and now bishop e6 is played, and Magnus goes b3. Now he could have traded on e6 here, and after castles, we reach positions that have been played a lot in the games between myself and Jospim, the famous Peruvian grandmaster Jose Alcantara Martinez. So those of you who have seen a lot of our Arena Kings battles or have not seen them, you can definitely check them out. But we've had a lot of games with this very similar structure of all these pawns in the center of the board. So Magnus plays b3 here to kind of avoid that. Additionally, if black captures the bishop, you can take with the b pawn, and you have a really nice chain of pawns here from c2 to e4 and to c4. Additionally, you open up the b file, target the pawn on b7, and last but not least, you also control the break on d5. You control this critical square, so black does not have any breaks in the center of the board. So now we have castles played here by Magnus, and we have d5 played by Vidit, trying to open up the center. And here, as you see, you have 1 2 3 guarding the pawn. White has 1 2 3 attacking, so you are not losing material. So we have e takes d5, knight takes d5, queen to d2 played by Magnus, and now Vidit captures and plays queen d6. Again, very flat position objectively. You have a symmetrical pawn structure here. All the pawns are pretty much on the same side for the most part. There is a slight imbalance with the f pawn versus the d pawn, but overall very few weaknesses for either side. So now we have knight to d2 played by Magnus, with the idea of going knight to e4 to attack the queen. Potential ideas involve something like king h8, knight to e4, queen e7, let's say you just trade, and then knight c5, and you attack the queen on e6 and the pawn on b7. And after something like queen c8, maybe even a move like b4, b5 to undermine the knight, and it should be a little bit better for white. So back to this position after knight to d2, f5 is played here by Vidit. Now the idea, of course, is pretty straightforward, to prevent the knight from going to e4 here, and then to c5. So here Magnus trades the bishops on e6, and now he goes queen c4. And Magnus, one thing he's done very well over the years is he's been known as an endgame magician. The amount of endgames that Magnus has won is innumerable. I mean, on a single hand, I can't even count them. So he goes for this endgame. However, one of the weird things about this endgame, unlike a lot of the endgames that Magnus has played, is that even though the position is objectively equal here up to this point, there isn't really an imbalance per se. Whereas in all these equal endgames, Magnus generally has some sort of there's some sort of imbalance that he can use to his advantage. I will say I'm a little bit surprised here that Vidit trades the queens. I personally would have probably played rook a e8 here just to keep the structure the same. And again, if white trades here, not much is happening. You'll see no real weaknesses for either side. Instead, in this position, Vidit captures. And I suspect that in retrospect, Vidit probably, I wouldn't say he regrets playing this move, but he probably would not have played it if he had realized it after b takes c4. Now there is actually a true imbalance. White tries to play in the center of the board. Additionally, white has an open b file here. And if white can get c3 and say long term, I play moves like king h8, king f2, king g8, king e2, king h8. I can get c3 and d4 and, for example, to highlight the point. After, say, rook e8, king d3, white has a little bit of a pull. You've got a nice pawn structure in the middle of the board. You can play rook b1 to attack the pawn on b7. And it feels a little bit uncomfortable for black. So as we go back, after b takes c4 is played, Vidit decides here that he doesn't want a long, grindy game. He just wants to try to go for the simplifications immediately, and he plays e4. Now, in retrospect, I suspect that if he had been playing someone other than Magnus, there's a good chance that Vidit would have played knight b4, rook fc1, a5. Now let's say white plays rook a b1 here. You can now go b6. And black should be a little bit better here. There's a weak pawn on a4. Potentially you can reroute the knight to c5. Additionally, this knight cannot be removed from b4 as it's protected by the pawn on a5. And last but not least, white cannot kick the knight with c3 because then you capture the pawn on d3. So this knight is perfectly glued to the square, and the pawns on c2 and d3 are immobile. So I suspect that if Vidit had been playing someone other than Magnus, there's a very good chance that he would have played knight b4. But again, considering the situation of the opponent as well as how late in the tournament it is, Vidit decides, I'm just going to try to simplify and force a draw immediately. And he goes pawn to e4 here. And now d4 is played by Magnus. You do not take the pawn on e4 here because first of all, you wreck the structure. You have the two isos here, the isolated pawns on c4 and c2. And after f takes e4, let's just say you take the pawn on e4 here. Black can now play the move rook f to e8, attacking the knight on e4 and the pawn on e3. And white still is okay, but there are no winning chances because of these double pawns on c2 and c4. So back to the game. After e4, Magnus plays d4, trying to build this nice little center of pawns here with c3. So we have f4 played by Vidit, and here Magnus plays a very peculiar move. Now, during the game, I was quite concerned that after king f2, black could get into some trouble here, because if pawn takes pawn, king takes pawn, this e4 pawn is very weak. And in this position, if you don't take on e3, you also have to worry about the pawn on e4 being weak. And so let's just say you play a move like rook a8 to guard the pawn. After white goes c3 and consolidates the center, you become very worried that this pawn on e4 is just a weakness here, and there's not a whole lot that black can do about it. Again, computer says it's fine for black, but I was a little bit surprised not to see this from Magnus, trying to keep more play in the position. Instead, Magnus goes for a straight simplification. He plays rook takes f4, rook takes rook, pawn takes rook, and now knight takes d4 is played by Vidit. And again, we have even material, but with the double pawns on c2 and c4, black should be able to draw this relatively comfortably. Anyway, it is obviously Magnus, so the game goes on. Knight takes e4 is played here, and now knight to e2 check. Not knight takes c2, by the way, because after knight takes c2, white can play rook d1, and maybe there's some pressure with the rook coming down to d7, creating the classic kebab on the 7th rank. So we have knight to e2 check, king to f2, knight takes f4, and now Magnus plays rook b1, of course attacking the pawn on b7, and now b6 is played by Vidit. and Magnus goes c5. Again, you do have these weak double pawns here, so you really do want to try to get rid of them. We have c5, rook to f8 played here, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and now c4. You do not capture the pawn on b6 with the rook here because it is a poison pawn. I can now go knight to d5, checking the king on f2 and attacking at the rook, creating the classic discovered attack, or what we on Twitch call the fossil. So c4 is played here by Magnus, and now knight to d5 played by Vidit. Now, one thing that I will also note, having played Magnus probably over 100 times now in my long and illustrious career, is that you always have to be very, very careful when you're playing against Magnus to not sort of lose control or to not fall asleep at the wheel. And in this position, Vidit does fall asleep at the wheel here. He basically sees an idea going into a rook and pawn endgame, and he thinks he's going to draw very easily. Now in this position, it's not so easy to play for black, but I would probably say the simplest way to play it is what happens in the game with knight d5 check, king to e2, and now a move like knight to f6 offering the trade of the knights. If white trades after rook f6, this should be a draw pretty routinely, nothing to really worry about. If white plays a move like knight to d6, for example, you can go knight to d7, guarding the pawn on b6. Again, it should be a draw. However, after king to e2, Vidit falls asleep at the wheel here, and he thinks he's spotted an easy way to draw the game with this move rook to e8. Now, the reason that he thinks he's spotted an easy draw is because if white plays a move like king d3, you just take the knight. White cannot capture the rook because then you have knight c3 with the fork. And if white captures, you can go, this actually turns into the game where you can play rook takes a4. So we'll go back to the game. So pawn takes knight is played, rook takes e4, king to d3, rook takes a4. And I think that when Vidit was calculating this position prior to playing knight d5 on move number 27, he probably saw pawn to d6, king f7, rook takes b6, king e6, and thought, okay, easy draw. If you just take on b6 right away, king f7, rook b7, king f6, again, very easy draw here. If d6, you just go something like rook a2 potentially. You can also, after d6, play a move like rook to, I think rook to a1 is also another way that you can draw this as well. So there are many ways that you can draw the position here. And Vidit saw this and probably thought, okay, easy draw. However, here, white can play d6, king to f7, and white does not capture the pawn on b6. White has the very nice move, rook to e1 here, cutting off the king from the e file. You cannot bring the king closer. And now you have to be extremely careful. If you play a move just like a5, white can go d7, and again, game over. Cannot get the king over. The rook cuts the king. It's also worth noting that at this point in the game, white is actually winning here by 4. So we're going to have a couple of lines to go through. So after rook e1, rook to a5 is played by Vidit to stop the move d7, because then you have rook d5 check, winning the pawn. So Magnus plays king d4, and now rook a2 is played. Again, d7 is a clean threat, so you have to get behind the pawn to try to stop it from queening. King to d5 is played here by Magnus, and now Vidit plays rook d2, king to c6, and now b5. Now, oddly enough, this is still winning, but you have to be very, very careful. Now, you probably ask, well, how do we know this is winning? Now, the reason this is winning is because the computer tells us so, but also you can feel that with the pawns so close to the end of the board, these two pawns on a6 and b6 really don't matter. Now, let's say black plays another move, which I think a lot of people wonder about, which is you can just take the pawn on g2 here. And the reason that this is losing now is because I go d7, threatening to make a queen, rook d2, I go king c7, threatening to make the queen. Now you check on c2, I eat the pawn, and you go back. Now again, you probably think, wait a second, but how is this losing? The reason it's losing is because now without the pawn on b6, I can go king c7, rook c2, king to d8 here, and now you have many problems. Let's just say you play a move like rook d2. This is not the best move, but just to illustrate the point, white can now play rook to e7 check. If you go king f6, there's king to e8, and I make the queen. If you go king to f8 here, I can now build what we call the bridge with rook to e5 here. And after black plays, let's just say, I guess I'll play the obvious move, king to f7 here. I can actually, in this one, I can't quite build a bridge yet. So I guess what I would do is I would go rook c5 here. And after you play a move like g5, just king c8, king e7, rook c7 to win. And you'll make a queen next move. And if we go back here, let's say I play a move like rook d1, I can actually build a bridge now with rook f5 check, king g8, and now I go king e7, rook g1, or rook e1, king d6, rook d1, and I block with the rook. When you trade, king is too far away, And the reason that this didn't work in the other line, just to illustrate the point, is that after king to f7 here, if you go king c7, check, king d6, rook d2, rook d5, I can trade and my king gets over just in time here after king c6, king d8. So this is completely winning. Also, just to point that out, when you guys talk about videos, I've done a video on this. I think just about everybody's done a video on the classic Lucena position, where you have a rook and a pawn versus rook. So this is very well known. I would say anybody probably above a certain level has studied this. I myself, I think I demonstrated this for Bjergsen, who I think is about like 1000 rated at his peak. So it is a classic endgame theme that you really do need to learn. All right, so let's go back to the game. So after king c6, we now know that these moves like rook g2 don't work, and you have to be very active. And so here, b5 is played by Vidit. Now this is a very important move to play here, and the reason it is important is that the only thing that matters here is trying to create counterplay with this b pawn before this d pawn can get to the end of the board. So b5 is played here, and at this point in the game, Magnus had about 18 minutes and Vidit had about 3 minutes, and this is where Magnus misses a win. Now again, very dank win, very tough to spot or understand, but the win is rook to e7 check here. And after king to f6, logical move, you now go rook to e4. And the reason that this is winning is it's pretty random, but the reason this wins is because you cut the pawn off from advancing down the board. So you cut it off on the 4th rank, and now when black goes rook c2, king to d7, let's say you play a move like rook d2 here. After king to c7, rook to c2, you can now go king to d8, and after rook d2, d7, the problem is that I also have this move king to e8, threatening to push the pawn. So say you play a move like, I don't know, h5, king e8. Now I make the queen because you have no check on the e file. And if you go king to f7 here, for example, I can now play rook to e7 check. If king f6, king e8, same thing with the queen. And after king to f8 here, I think the cleanest way to win is probably rook to e8 check, king f7, and now king to c8. Pawn guards the rook. I threaten to queen as well. And after rook c2, king b7, no checks. Pawn is in the way of the check. And after rook d2 queen, rook takes, white is just winning. So after rook to e7, this is actually, I believe, winning if you let the computers get deep enough. Now, as you'll notice, the bar kind of goes all over the place. But after rook e4, this should be a technical win. However, as we noticed even from the interview with Magnus after the game, he himself did not really understand why this line is winning versus what he did in the game. So it's a very complex end game, and it's something that I could obviously probably spend 20 minutes going over, but this is a recap and we aren't going to get into all of the weeds of this whole end game. So instead, Magnus plays d7 here, which is also a very logical move, but now this is technically a draw, because after rook check, king b6, go back, king c7 check, king d8. Black is now just in time with this pawn b4 move, and as you'll notice with the rook on e4 stopping the pawn on b5, that makes a difference. Now the black pawn is simply too close to the end of the board for white to be able to win. And as you'll notice in this position, king is glued on d8. You'd love to go to the e file, but you can't because the king covers it. Can't go to the c file because the rook covers it. So what that means is somehow you have to dislodge either the king on f7 or the rook on c2. But you'll notice that in this position, black's pawn on b4 is very fast. Like, this pawn is rushing down the board. It's making a beeline to get there and make a new queen. So therefore in this position after b4, Magnus plays this move rook to e7, very similar to the previous lines, by the way. King to f8, and now he goes rook e3. Now what you would love to do here is play rook to e4, attacking the pawn. But after b3, you actually, maybe this is still a draw. Oh, this is actually still a draw technically, but just to explain, after rook e5, for example, let's say you go b3, I can go rook f5 check, king g8, king to e7, and now after rook e2, king d6, rook d2. Again, I have rook d5 to build the bridge, and I will make a queen and win the game by one tempo because your pawn's not on b2. However, the reason this is drawn is that after you play rook to e5, I can now very quietly play this move pawn to g6, stopping rook f5, and again, you have to worry about this b pawn. This b is going straight down the board. So here Magnus plays rook e3, trying to prevent the pawn from going to b3, and also lining up the idea of rook to f3 check. However, here black can simply play king f7, and now if you play rook to f3 check, I just go king g6, and you'll notice that when white moves the king, I can king e7, I can go check, king d6, check. Wherever you go, I just keep checking you because you can't build the bridge. The rook on f3 can't build the bridge in front of the king. The rook needs to be on f4 in order to go to d4. And if you go back, I just take the pawn. So you actually can't run the king out here from d8. So you can't run the king out, which means that, again, you're going to have to do something like rook e3, and I just go back. And if you don't do that, say you play a move like rook f4 to go rook d4, now I go b3, and my b pawn is way, way too fast here. So therefore, Magnus plays rook e7. King f8, not king f6, of course, because then again, king to e8 followed by d8 queen is winning the game. So king f8 is played by VD, and now we get rook e5 by Magnus, again trying to line up the bridge. And here VD, to his credit, does not blunder with b3 again, because rook f5, king g8, king e7, rook e2, king d6, rook d2, rook d5 is winning, because after trade b2, white makes a queen with check, king moves, and I just go back to b6 and collect the pawn on b2 or b1. So here VD plays g6 to stop the cut off with rook f5, and now after rook to e6 he plays b3, because again you aren't worried about this check after rook f6 because you go king g7, and now on king e7 it's the same problem. You have, after king e7, you have rook e2. If white plays rook e6, you can obviously just trade, as happens in the game. And now after b2, a pawn for my kingdom. The pawn gets to b1 at the same time as the white pawn gets to d8, and we have what leads to a draw. So after d8 queen, b1 queen is played, queen c7, king to g8, and now queen d8, king g7. And of course we could have had a repetition many ways: queen c7, queen e7, queen f6. All roads lead to the same result, with the game ending in a draw. But it's really important in endgames, especially, like you look at this imbalance as we go back. I'll go back quite a few moves back to this point. Black could have tried to save both of these pawns after rook c2, king d8. Try to save them both and run them up, but because this white pawn is so advanced, in endgames very oftentimes it comes down to passed pawns, and you have to use them to generate counterplay. So Vidit very correctly realized that this pawn is one square away, and the only way to save the game is to force this pawn down the board, try to use your counterplay and get this one down at the same time. Very good defense by VD, seeing b5 and figuring out how to defend. Of course, he allowed this endgame, which technically was losing, with this rook e7 move, all the way back on move number 35. But again, very, very difficult. Magnus didn't see it. I don't even really understand why it's winning myself, so can't really critique him. But with this draw, of course, Magnus keeps his lead in the tournament. But it's going to be an uphill struggle here to try and gain rating points. I still think that he's most likely going to win the tournament. He does play with the black piece tomorrow against Fabiano Caruana, so that should be a very exciting game, but it will be Magnus's tournament to lose. And so this was a very exciting game. I hope you enjoyed the recap, and we'll see what happens tomorrow in round 12 of the Tata Steel Chess Masters, you guys. Watch the Magnus interview. Is there a Magnus interview? Let's see. There is.
Yeah. It was like the moment with like rook e7 instead of d7, right?
Yeah. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it a little bit. There were, I mean, a couple of moves before. Of course, I thought it was pretty dead draw. Wasn't even clear how I was gonna try. But yeah, this knight d5 and.
Were you surprised by the knight trade?
Yeah, no, I was pretty sure he'd missed this rook e1 idea. And yeah, that was obviously a pleasant surprise. Yeah, clearly I could have spent some more time there. That was a bit unfortunate. I thought I didn't have any other moves there, and if there were chances, I'd look for them later. But maybe they were right there.
It's quite a weird day, which might actually turn out to be very well for your chances to win the tournament. Dubov tested positive, which will have the anticlimax in the last round where you don't play a game. Jordan beat Anish Giri.
Yeah, sure. I'm more concerned about my own performance, to be honest. So today wasn't great. But yeah, obviously I got very very lucky with with circumstances that were out of my control. I just hope that Daniel is doing fine. It seemed this morning that he was feeling okay, and I really hope he can make it to Berlin for the Grand Prix. I think that's the tournament was kind of ruined for him anyway, but that's I think his biggest priority, as well as obviously staying relatively healthy.
Yeah. Tomorrow you will play your last game of the tournament against Fabiano Caruana. It's going to be quite a big game to close the tournament.
Yeah, it's going to be a big game tomorrow, of course. I thought Fabi played after a while a really interesting game today against Prague. I thought like for a brief moment in the opening he was considerably worse, but it passed, and then he went on to win a nice game.
Any comments on the Jordan van Verrees game today?
Yeah, sure. I wasn't very happy as somebody who's competing for tournament victory after before I'd made any of my moves. He'd already played the same-ish, but yeah, you gotta say he played a very good game as far as I could see, and it goes to show his top level is very high. He can play some awesome games, and I'm happy for him.
Okay. Well, thank you, and all the best tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah, good interview. So we are done with all the games today. Pretty early day, but I guess we can recap it for everybody who's just tuning in right now and take a look at the results.
Yeah, so if we have a look at the standings, we see that Magnus is in the lead with 7.5 points going into the final 2 rounds. Richie Rappert is right behind him with 7 points. Then we have Anish and Shaq Majarov with 6.5. And then we have a pack with 6 +1. Yesipenko, Karyakin, Vidit, and Caruana. Then on 50%, we have Jordan van Verrees, who won a great game today. Then we have Duda with 5 points. We have Sam Shankland on 4.5. Then we have Dubov, whose tournament is sadly over, and Niels Grandelius and Prague. So yeah, what are the pairings tomorrow, Hikaru?
So tomorrow, I don't have the pairings because chess.com doesn't have them on the page. So I guess I will pull it up on another page. Yeah, I'll take a look. Okay. Where is it?
Sure.
I don't have them actually, so I'll let you do it.
Okay. Well, tomorrow Magnus is playing Fabiano with the black pieces. Richard Rapport is playing Yesipenko with the black pieces. Then we have Shankland taking on Sergey Karyakin. We have Vidit Mamedyarov. We have Dubov versus Prague. Yesipenko, I already said that one. We have Anish against Grandelius. So Anish is definitely looking to strike there, trying to get a bit up in the standings. And we have Duda against Jordan. That's going to be an absolute banger as well.
Right, exactly. So it's going to be exciting in round 12 tomorrow. I think probably the last chance maybe for some drama, perhaps if Richie can win his game. But I would say pretty unlikely. I think Magnus, as Fabiano alluded to, he gets the automatic win in the final round, which is, it's always nice when in the final round you have an automatic win. So I mean, I feel like if I had an automatic win in the final round of every tournament, I'd probably do quite well. I think I'd win a lot of tournaments, make a lot of cash. But at any rate, I mean, joking aside, obviously, very unfortunate what's happened. But still, we have 2 more days left, so it's gonna be exciting as we head into the finish.